Thank you very much for kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yukie Nagai. I'm very happy to be here and also to share our latest research achievement inspired by the neuroscience theory called predictive coding. Is this clear? Okay. Let me start with one video clip showing that what kind of technique we are using in the lab. We have been developing a computational neural network model inspired by the neuroscience and the developmental psychology studies, and we investigate how the humanoid robot can learn to interact with human caregivers. This is one example. I will explain the details of the underlying mechanism later, but you can see that our robot, the ICAP, can learn to communicate with human caregivers, especially here, the robot learns to interpret their emotional state of the humans by reading their facial expression, the speech, and also the gesture and so on. And then our main research question here is that what neural mechanism underlies the cognitive development, especially how the human babies can acquire social intelligences. And we'd like to understand such an underlying mechanism by developing the computational models. For example, if you look at the human babies, you realize that the human babies are born with very immature capabilities. For example, they don't know how their body look like, so they often do their body bubbling in order to first control their body in an intentional manner. And then once they learn to acquire the sensory motor skills, then they also acquire the social intelligence, which is the theme of this workshop. But here the research question or open question is how social intelligence really emerges through the sensory motor experiences. There is no like an explicit teaching signal for the babies to acquire the social intelligences. And also another important aspect in this social intelligence is the neurodiversity or individual diversity. We know that some children show their typical developmental trajectories, whereas some others show the atypical developmental trajectory, which correspond to the autism spectrum disorders. In today's talk, I'd like to mainly focus on their continuity in the development, how the social intelligence, social cognitive abilities emerges based on the sensory motor experiences. And then we are thinking what underlying mechanism, what neural mechanism can underlie this continuous development. And we have been looked at the neuroscience theories called predictive coding, which has been now attracting their amount of their attention in the neurosciences and also in the developmental robotics. The key idea here is that our human brain works as a predictive machine. When, for example, you perceive the world, you of course receive that incoming sensory signal from the visual, audio, tactile, and so on. But your brain does not simply rely on the incoming sensory signal, but rather it utilizes the internal model to predict the world. This internal model is acquired through your own experiences. Through your sensory motor experiences, you can learn the knowledges and also the word model. And the internal model enables your brain to make a prediction about the world. This is the yellow expressed by the yellow arrows. And then in your brain, this top-down prediction signal and the bottom-up incoming signal are integrated to perceive the world. And interestingly, their motor execution is also explained in a similar way. When you act on the environment, you have their proprioceptive signal as an incoming sensory signal. And your brain, again, through the internal model, your brain makes predictions about your proprioceptive world. And then by minimizing their prediction error, the gap between the incoming sensory signal and the top-down, the intended, your postures, then you can change your motor system, which result in the motor behaviors. Here, an additional, the important idea is that the process of integrating two signals obeys the Bayes theorem. Here, the top-down prediction is represented as a yellow Gaussian distribution, which has mean and some variances, which mean that when your prediction is not so clear, it's not certain, then you have some variances in a predictive signal. And also your sensory signal here is represented as a red Gaussian distribution, also has some noises. Depending on the environment, your sensory signal is not always accurate. Then their sensory signal also comes with some noises. And then based on the Bayes theorem, your brain integrates this top-down incoming sensory signal, this red Gaussian distribution, and the top-down prior signal, which is represented the yellow Gaussian distribution here. And as a result, you get this orange Gaussian distribution, which corresponds to the perception of the world. If your incoming sensory signal is very accurate while your prediction is still immature, then you rely more on the incoming sensory signal. On the other hand, if you are in a very noisy environment, but if you have a clear world model, then you rely more on that top-down predictions. In this way, your brain can adaptively change how strongly the brain relies on the incoming sensory signal and top-down prediction. Let me give you one example to demonstrate that your brain also works as a predictive machine, even for the very simple example. This is a very well-known optical illusions, so some of you may know that what I want to say. But I want you to focus here now on the two regions, region A and region B. The question is, which region A or B, looks brighter for you? I guess, I'm sure that I asked this question many times in our lectures, and 80% of the students answers that the B looks brighter. Of course, I know everything, but then still B looks brighter for me. But in fact, these two regions have exactly the same luminance. Now I show two gray bars, which is a solid gray bar. So then now you can more directly compare the luminance or the grayscale of the region A and B. And now I hope that you realize that these two regions have exactly same luminances. But then once I remove this, again, maybe you still see that the B region looks brighter. This is because the region B corresponds to the white area on the checkerboard. So even if it's in a shadow, it must look brighter in your brain because your brain always utilizes their knowledge about the world. So this is a nice example showing that even in a very simple cognitive task, your brain always utilizes the prediction model. So the question is how we can utilize or extend this idea to explain their social intelligence. To make clear the motivation of our study, I'd like to show this video clip, which is actually also introduced in today's morning by the organizer. This is an experiment conducted at Max Planck Institute, and the researchers tested at what age children become able to help other persons. In order to help other persons, the children must be able to infer the intention or goal of other persons, or they also have to be able to select proper actions to achieve the goal. In this case, the experimenter dropped a clothespin on the floor, and child spontaneously get closer to the experimenter and then gave the clothespin back to the experimenter. Here, the important thing is that they do not receive any social feedback or reward. They don't get any positive reward or positive feedback, but still they are strongly encouraged to help others. So the question is where this motivation comes from. This is kind of social motivation. So where this motivation comes from? What brain mechanism enable children to produce this kind of social helping behavior? There is one interesting study in psychology again to explain or to emphasize the importance of their action execution by themselves. In order to infer the other action intentions, children have to have their own motor experiences. In this experiment, the psychologists corrected the 3-month-old babies who are still too young to manipulate an object yet. So which means that even if they are shown with some video clip in which the experimenter tries to reach for an object, the 3-month-old babies still cannot infer the intention of the goal yet because they don't have the experiences yet. But then if they provide the opportunities to explore the world by themselves. So in this case, the children are given with sticky medium, and then by moving their hands, they can randomly catch the object. So in this way, the children have their special experiences of acting on the environment. But then in these two groups, the first group, children were given these motor experiences before observing other person's behaviors. Another group, watch first infants, are given with these motor experiences only after they watched other person's behaviors. And with differences can be found in the looking time of the children when they are shown with their new video clips. In the new video clips, the experimenter is reaching for a new object position or new object at the same positions. And then the question is whether the children are more get interested in this event. And the researchers found out that only this red one, reach first infants, looked longer, significantly longer, the new goal event, which means that the children who had their motor experiences beforehand could interpret the intention or the goal of other persons. This is why the children in reach first group get surprised when they saw that the experimenter is now reaching for different object. This is a very nice example showing that how their motor experiences can drastically change the infant internal model or the abilities to infer intentions. And if you're familiar also with the neuroscience theories, you may also come up with the idea of mirror neurons or mirror neuron systems. It is very known that the monkey's brain and also the human brain have their motor neurons or their systems of motor neurons, which activate not only when producing the action, but also when observing the actions. Of course, the motor neurons are supposed to activate when producing the actions. But then the interesting point here is that the motor neurons activate also when the monkey or the humans are observing other persons, which means that your brain also utilizes your own motor experiences in order to recognize and infer the goal of the intention of other persons. So inspired by this psychology and the neuroscience studies, we have started developing the computational neural network model. We have several different types of models, but I'd like to start with a very, very simple one so that everyone can get the ideas. Here we introduced a deep autoencoder. And this deep autoencoder was first trained with the robot motor experiences. We used the ICAV robot, and the ICAV robot is now learning to reach for an object. So learning to reach for an object means that the robot can receive multimodal signals. In this case, the robot gets the camera image as a visual input, and also the tactile signal. When the robot touches the object, it can get a tactile signal on the palm, and also the proprioceptive signal. In this case, the joint angle of the robot. And these three modality signals are integrated in this deep autoencoder, which are fully connected. And then, as you know, the deep autoencoder tries to reconstruct the original input signal as an output, and then try to minimize the reconstruction error. Here, I would say this also corresponds to prediction error. The network basically tries to predict the incoming sensory signal, which has a basic function of the internal model. The learning of this reaching behavior itself is not so challenging because we can collect the multimodal signals, give it to the network, and then update the network connecting way through their backpropagations. The interesting point here is the next step. How this network can be utilized when the robot is observing another robot. Now I introduce the green robot, which is now reaching for an object, and the blue robot, which has this neural network model, is just observing green robot. Observation means that the blue robot can basically get the visual input, no tactile, no proprioceptive signal, because it is just standing. But interestingly, as this deep autoencoder was trained through their multimodal integrations, we can expect that this network would predict not only the visual signal, but also the tactile and the proprioceptive signal. because in the middle layer of deep autoencoder, which are fully connected, the middle layer, the network is supposed to acquire the kind of symbolic amodal representation of the region. So through this amodal representation, we can expect that the visual and the proprioceptive signal, which are the imaginary signal, can be also generated through this network. So we tested whether our hypothesis can work properly or not. In these scenarios, we designed two experimental learning scenarios. In one scenario, the robot trained the presented network through the action generation experiences, which means that the network receives visual, tactile, and proprioceptive signals through the learning, as I explained. In the second condition, I trained the network, but using only the visual input, no proprioceptive, no tactile signal, meaning that the robot can also learn something just by observing, through learning through observations. So we could demonstrate to what extent this observational learning can also achieve in order to infer the goal of the other robot. Here, the colorful bars are showing the accuracy of the predictions, and the green one corresponds to the correct goal predictions. And now please compare these green bars on the left side and right side. You can see that the left side, the green bar gets higher and higher, indicating that the learning through action generations has a greater impact on improving their prediction performances. This is a behavioral result, but as an advantage of using the neural network model, we can also closely analyze the internal representation of the network. We apply the principal component analysis to visualize the middle layer of the deep autoencoder in three-dimensional space. Here you can see red, blue, and green lines, which corresponds to the three reaching behavior, reaching for left object, reaching for center, reaching for the right. And you can see that the left side 3D image showing the structured, very, very structured representation, whereas the right side graph showing the not well structured representation. Three lines are somehow separated, but you cannot clearly see the hierarchical structures compared to the left one, which showing that the learning through observation can also work to some extent, but in terms of accuracy of the predictions, which is much worse than the neural network model learned through the action generation. And then by extending this network model, we can also show that our robot also produces the helping behavior, as we have seen in the very first video clip. Here, this robot has already trained to achieve the two different actions. One is to reach or cover the red marker, the other is to push the blue curve. And then after learning these two action primitives, the robot is now observing what the person is trying to do. And here, intentionally, my former students failed in achieving the goal. The object was too far and he could not reach for an object. And now you can see their prediction error graph on the bottom right. And then as soon as the person failed in achieving the goal, you can see the rising curve of the prediction error. Because the robot is always making the prediction about the world. As the robot has already learned to achieve the goal, pushing the blue curve or covering a red marker by himself, he always tries to minimize the prediction error. First, compare the predicted state and observed state, and then as soon as the prediction error, the discrepancy between the predicted state and the actual state is observed, the robot tries to minimize prediction error. This is only the one motivation this robot has. In other words, this robot does not have any social motivation yet. The motivation this robot has is only the prediction error minimization. The robot always changes the world as it predicted. This might be the one original form of the emergence of the social intelligence. This is a great example, but then we also face the one problem, which is the perspective taking. For example, what I can see now and what you can see now is different. You cannot see, for example, the display of my laptop because of the different positions. This perspective taking is also very important, and only in the later stage of the child development, children acquire this ability. So to achieve this perspective taking, we extended our deep autoencoder model with more layers and also there are additional functions here in the network. The key idea is the same with the deep autoencoder. The robot learns to manipulate an object, and then it received first the camera image as an input, and also the joint angles here, the proprioceptive signal. And these two modality signals are first abstracted into the small dimensional spaces, and then afterward, it is integrated into the common latent state. Here, the common latent state plays an important role to integrate the merge model signals and the acquired symbolic representation of the object manipulations. And then here again, the goal of this network is to minimize the prediction error. The output of the network is again the image and the joint angle, so that the network can reconstruct the original input signal. Again, the network tries to minimize the prediction error. So we trained this neural network model only using the robot's own motor executions. And here, we call self-robot. The self-robot is always placed the near side of the table. I'm sorry that there is not so visible, but there is a table on this image, in this image, and then the self-robot is always placed the bottom side or the near side of the table. And then after training this motor execution experiences, we gave the observation of another robot. Here, another robot is placed always at a different position from the self-robot, either at the far side of the table or left side or right side, any position different from the self-robot. The question is whether the robot which learned only its own motor experiences can infer the goal of the other robot or not. We gave this observation first as an example. As I explained, the other robot is placed at the far side or left side, right side, a different position from the self-robot. And then through the network model, we let our model to infer the goal of the robot. Here, middle, you can see the ground truth of the image, and then the rightmost image is the imitated or predicted image signal from the network model. And please note that, please carefully look at the movement of the object. You can see that the yellow object moved to the different directions. But then in terms of the intention or the goal of the actions to pull the object, the robot could successfully achieve their goal of the action, pulling the object toward its body. But interestingly, this intention can be adaptively changed based on their observational signal. In order to verify what is a clue for the robot to infer the intention, we created two interesting scenarios. In one scenario, the robot could observe only the end effector of another robot. You don't know where the basis of the robot is. In this case, interestingly, the self-robot produced the movement of the object because there is no idea where the robot whole body is. So in this case, the robot changed their attention point towards the goal of the positions. And then now you can see that the yellow object moving to the same directions. Then we thought that, okay, what is the real differences between these middle condition and the top right condition? We introduced only the base of the robot. You can see here, the right bottom side. With this, the basement of the robot and the end effector, we actually did not know what happens. But then interestingly, we found that only the base part of the robot body is already strong enough to change the inferred intention. Now the robot producing the intention of the goal to intention of the actions to pull the object. So we found that by just changing the visual information, the robot can adaptively switch the estimated intention with this model. And then again, the interesting analysis is to go more in detail of the internal representation of the network, which corresponds to the internal model of our brain. Here we have seen that the visual information and the proprioceptive signals are completely separated in the very beginning of learning. But then through the learning, you can see that there this red cluster and blue clusters gradually getting closer and closer. And then finally it completely overlaps, which really showing that how much model representation, especially here the sensory motor experiences are represented in the internal model as a march model, a model representation, which is the important functions for the robot to infer the intention of the goal, other person's goal. Then we could also compare the two scenarios where the robot learned the same actions through the motor experiences, and also again the learning through only the observations to see how the motor experiences would impact on their learning performances. You can see that the right side, the robot hands get blurred. You cannot clearly see the image. That actually means that the network predictions was also getting inaccurate. It is represented using the Gaussian distributions, so the larger noises in the predictions are now represented in a blurred image in the predicted signal. This is the motor experiences, and then I'd like to quickly go through the emotional experiment, which corresponds to the very first video clip. In this emotional estimation experiment, we utilize the visual and audio signals. The key idea here, again, is very similar to the deep autoencoder. The robot collect the multimodal signals and then abstract into the smaller dimensional space and then try to reconstruct the original input signal. And by using this network, we could find that the robot could first acquire the structural representation of the emotions. Here, the network or the robot did not receive any explicit teaching signal, but then through the self-organization of the incoming multisensory signal, the robot could acquire the different emotional category after the learning. And then by using this internal model, we could also show that the robot can utilize the mental simulation, which is the part of the prediction abilities. For example, after the training of the network, we provided only the audio signal as an input. Imagine that you are closing your eyes, but just hearing someone's voice. But you can still imagine how the facial expression look like through the audio. We tested whether this network can do also the similar things. And we found that the very first estimation of the emotional state using only the audio signal was very inaccurate, which is very far from the truth value, but then through the imaginary predictions, the network could acquire more accurate estimations of the emotional state. And then let me quickly conclude my talk. I introduced the idea of the called predictive coding, which becomes a very, very popular now in neurosciences and cognitive sciences. The key idea here is that our brain acquires the internal model, or you can also say word model. And then using this internal model or word model, the brain always make a prediction about the word. When you perceive the word, of course, you receive the incoming sensory signal, but you don't simply rely on this incoming sensory signal. Your brain always makes predictions and then integrate this predicted signal and the incoming signal to perceive the word and also to act on the environment. And what we found is that the social abilities, for example, to infer the intention of others and also making a helping behavior, this predictive coding idea can be naturally extended. First, we think that the sensory motor learning is a process to acquire more accurate prior predictions. Human babies are born with very immature ability, which means that their accuracy is also low. But then through the sensory motor learning, it can acquire more accurate prior predictions. And once children and robots acquire more accurate prior predictions, now it can utilize this to infer the intention of the other persons. When we see the persons, we cannot access all sensory signals for the other persons. We have to predict. Our prediction abilities can be applied to predict other person's sensory signals and also the internal state. And as a result, the robot can do the mental simulations and also mirror neuron system. And as a result, the robot can better estimate the internal state of the others. Okay, then thank you very much for your kind attentions, and I'm happy to receive your questions.
So I guess we'd start by taking questions from people in person. Okay, so there's a question.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. It's really cool to see the intersection of neuroscience and robotics.
Thank you.
My name's Rachel Burns, by the way. My question is about when you showed the robot emotions and the robot was able to separate the emotions or accurately identify like 7 different categories. How many people did the robot understand one person really well or several people really well?
In this experiment, we utilized like about 10 persons signals, but actually here that I show the first and the second principal component, but then if you go to the third principal component, we can actually see the individual differences because we don't explicitly tell whose emotional signals are given. So, and then of course, we know that the differences in the emotion expression is also very large. Some persons produces very intensively their emotional state. Some persons do not show such an intensive signal. So in that case, their third or fourth principal component often represent the individual differences.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks again for the talk. It was very, very interesting. I just wanted to ask a very brief question, which is how, if at all, have you guys thought about reconciling this sort of predictive approach with like reward-based methods? Like a lot of reinforcement learning obviously uses reward to influence action in addition to sort of predictive coding type things, or at least predicting reward. I'm just curious how you guys, if at all, have reconciled these sorts of things.
Yeah, thank you very much for the very important questions. Actually, the predictive coding, people tries to also integrate the reinforcement learning idea. The reinforcement signal is also just a signal at the beginning. So there is no like a special meaning there. Just the networks or the brain tries to predict when the signal, which corresponds to reward, is coming. Based on this, maybe that we can also explain that how the reinforcement learning can be also integrated in the predictive coding idea. Still in the way, but I hope that we can also somehow integrate the reinforcement ideas into the predictive coding.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. My name is Nayoung, and I have a question about the experiment at the current slide. So does the model trained with the multimodal signal has a better accuracy than the model trained with the single auditory signal in the case of testing with the same data set? And if so, it is why?
In this case, we did not do such two different scenarios during the training. This is only after the training. After we trained the network model, we provided only the audio signal to see whether the network makes the mental simulations. But I think the idea is the same with the previous experiments. In the previous experiment, we had there 2 learning scenarios. First scenario, the robot received the multimodal signals. The second scenario, robot received only the visual signal. It's learning through observations. And then always the multimodal learning is better than the single modal learning.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for the great talk. My curiosity is about the emotion work. So emotion, it's not just the facial expression. Usually context is very important. So when you're crying, sometimes it's because you're very happy, not very sad. So my wife was crying on our wedding day, and I hope that it's because she's happy, not because she's sad. And I think that how might you integrate context into the models that you're developing? And can you give us some clarity on that? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the important questions. In this current experiment, we don't integrate the context at all, but in principle, we can utilize it as just a visual input signals, not only the facial expression, but the context can be observed through the vision, audio, many other modality signals. And then we don't really separate, okay, this is the person's information or context information, but then robot just received all incoming sensory signals to make a predictions. Of course, it's still very challenging because as you said, the client can mean happy or sad or even more. So down there, I'm not sure yet to what extent these predictive ideas can really understand or recognize such a different context. But in principle, we can integrate the all modality signals in this model.
Can I ask one more? Okay, so great. I think that's true actually, but I think it's just hard to learn because there's so many conflicting signals sometimes. My next question is about human beings. So we typically leverage our own internal representations when reasoning about others, as you have shown in your work. But we have a kind of leverage. You and I are not that different in terms of our brain makeup, right? We feel hopefully somewhat similarly when we feel sad and happy, and we utilize this when we're predicting the intent or goals or feelings of other agents, other human agents. But the robots don't have these. So do you think that we need to put these in somehow? Or if yes, then how? Or maybe you don't, maybe everything can be learned. So I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's also a very important question. Actually, our current challenge is to integrate the interceptive signal into robot. As you pointed out, how robot feels or how robot recognizes still completely different from what human does. The biggest difference is the existence of the interceptive signal, which corresponds to the heartbeat, the movement of the stomach, the body temperature, and so on. Such a body state, the internal state, of very, very important to have the emotional state. And then now we actually trying to model the interceptive signal as a computational model. Also, we are measuring the human interceptive signals and then try to understand how human utilize their heartbeat signal to recognize a word, for example. That is our ongoing challenge.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question.
Thank you. Are there any more questions from attendees in person?
I have a question about the model. In robotics, also in motion, we are using autoencoders. But I would like to know if you think there is a better model that we could use than just using autoencoders.
Yes. For example, this is similar to the autoencoder, but then it shares the incoming bottom-up processes and top-down processes, which better simulate the predictive coding ideas. But this, again, still have some limitations. For example, that it does not have like a recurrent network processes, which mean that it cannot process the temporal dynamics yet. It's just one-shot estimations. So there are actually many more network model which extend our ideas. But then in order to verify our first ideas or hypothesis, we thought that this is complex enough to test it. But if you go to the machine learning communities, you can learn many more sophisticated models.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions online? Really quickly check. No.
Angelica.
Angelica, would you like to unmute yourself and ask the question?
Yes, thank you so much, Yukie, for the great talk as usual. I wanted to ask about your result between action generation and action observation. So do you expect that there would be a different result if it was action generated by someone else? So for example, robot motion, but through demonstration. So you're moving the own robot's arm as opposed to the robot having its own intention to move the arm.
Sorry, I might miss your point. So in this experiment, the self-robot is observing the other robot, and then what is your point?
Oh, sorry, this is for a different experiment. It's for the one that was earlier. Yes, it's the one action perception improved by motor experiences. And in this one, you found this difference here, very interesting difference. So here, the action was generated by the robot making its own action. But I guess in humans, there's some difference, right? So if you're trying to teach the kid or baby how to do something by holding their hand to do it versus the baby making their own goal, intention, and doing the action, there's some difference. So how can we integrate that
Mm.
here? Is there any difference, or what is your thought on this one?
Yeah, in this experiment, the robot somehow is similar to the kinesthetic teaching because the robot was given with the target, their body movement for training. So although the robot was not really manipulated by other persons, but then what we make as a learning scenario is very similar to the kinesthetic teaching. So instead of doing the body bubbling, the robot tries to replicate the given their trajectories.
Okay, so if it's doing, go ahead.
So the differences can be created if we make their body bubbling processes. So without having the clear intention in the beginning, but then we can also let the robot to explore the board by itself and then try to find what is there like a contingent real result after the random explorations.
I see. So expect some other result from this. Okay,
Yep.
thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Yukie, for the wonderful talk. Please, let's thank the speaker once again.